The rain had been falling without pause since before dawn, soaking the woodland edge until the ground was a patchwork of mud and shallow pools, the grass pressed flat beneath the weight of water. The steady hiss of rainfall filled the air, blending with the dull roar of wind through sodden leaves, broken now and then by the brittle snap of branches giving way under the strain. Ranger Elena walked the narrow track, her boots pushing against water that had spilt from the swollen drainage ditch, her task to check the sections most at risk of flooding. Then, cutting sharply through the background noise, came a sound she could not ignore. Thin, high, and stretched with a strain that spoke of effort. It was not the trill of a bird or the brief bark of a deer. It was shorter, urgent, and repeated with pauses in between, as though the caller had to gather strength before trying again. She stopped mid-step, tilted her head to listen, and when it came again, she recognized the source. A fox cub, somewhere close, crying in the storm. The direction was uncertain at first, blurred by the shifting wind, but as she moved toward the sound it grew clearer, pulling her attention toward the ditch where the bank dipped lower and the grass grew long. She found him there, huddled in the sodden fringe of green, no bigger than a house cat, his fur slick and plastered close to his thin frame. Every hair lay flat, darkened by water, making his small body seem frailer still. His legs trembled where they stood in shallow water, each step uncertain as the ground sucked lightly at his paws. He called again, a wavering cry that was quickly swallowed by the wind, and then he lowered his head as though even that call had cost him too much energy. His sides moved quickly, breath short and shallow. Elena stepped slowly from the track into the wet verge, each move measured to avoid startling him. Her boots sinking with soft suction into the mud. The cub's ears twitched back at her presence, his head turning enough to keep her in sight while the rest of his body remained tensed, ready to flee if she came too close. His tail hung low, the tip barely moving, stuck against his hind legs by the rein. She crouched, letting her body language match the quiet tone she used. A low, steady voice that wouldn't cut through the storm, but might reach him. He didn't bolt, but neither did he come closer. Instead, he eased himself into a lower crouch close to the ground, eyes still fixed on her. A sudden gust sent rain lashing sideways through the trees, rattling the branches, and the cub flinched, curling into himself, his nose almost to his paws. It was a defensive posture that looked small and fragile against the open ditch. She could see the tension in the set of his muscles, the faint shiver that rippled along his flank with the cold. In this weather, alone and already soaked through, his body would be working hard just to stay warm. If his reserves ran out before he found shelter, the cold would win quickly. In a storm like this, the line between life and death for an animal his size could be measured in the smallest increments. The drop in body temperature, the extra minutes spent exposed. Elena's eyes swept the tree line, searching for movement, the flick of another tail, or the glint of a second set of eyes that might signal a nearby mother or sibling, but there was only the restless sway of rain-heavy leaves. No answering call came to him. She could imagine the search he might have made earlier, wandering from cover to cover, only to be driven back by the wind and water. Each moment out here, with the ground draining him and no adult fox to guide him, narrowed his chances. The cub gave himself a small shake, sending droplets scattering from his ears, and tried to step back into the grass. His front paw sank deeper than expected, holding him for a second, the mud reluctant to release him. He pulled it free and set it back where it had been, as if unsure of where else to go. Elena took the opportunity to shorten the distance between them by a careful step. "Easy now," she said, her words soft enough to be almost part of the weather. The cub's ears tipped toward her voice, but his gaze did not waver, unblinking and alert. Another wind gust shook the grass, and this time he shifted sideways, angling slightly away from the open ditch, his body weight turning toward the denser cover. It was a small movement, but significant. Any step toward shelter mattered. She stayed still, resisting the urge to close the gap too quickly. Yet, in a situation like this, trust was built in fractions of seconds, and pushing too soon could send him into flight, burning precious energy he could not afford to waste. His next call was weaker. More air than sound, a strained breath that told her what the storm had already taken from him. Out here, in the downpour, even a pause too long could cost him the strength to move again. The rain streamed from the edge of her hood, pooling at her collar, and the mud pulled at her boots with each slow advance. Yet she kept her eyes on him, reading every flick of his ears, every tiny weight shift. She knew now that time was narrowing, that his survival depended not on finding his family but on helping him reach shelter before the cold settled too deep into his small body. The woodland felt close around them, the rain a constant curtain, and in that space she understood the balance. Move with care, but move soon, before stillness becomes something final. The cry came again, thinner this time as Elena pushed through the wet grass toward the bend in the track. The storm had deepened, rain falling harder now, pooling in every hollow and running in thin sheets across the flattened undergrowth. The cub stood just beyond a tangle of sedge, his body no more than a soaked silhouette against the dark earth. Every part of him was pressed inward. Tail clamped to his legs, shoulders hunched, fur flattened in narrow streaks along his spine. His head hung slightly, eyes half closed, blinking only when the wind drove rain against his face. She stopped several paces away, letting the space remain between them. He was too exposed here, the open ditch only a step behind him, the ground beneath his paws unsteady. His chest moved quickly, the rise and fall too fast for rest, each breath visible in the shallow pull of his ribs. When the wind shifted, carrying her scent toward him, his ears flicked back and forward again, a small reflex that showed he was aware but not ready to move. She lowered herself slowly until one knee sank into the mud, the water seeping instantly into the fabric. Her hands stayed still at her sides, and when she spoke it was low and even. The words meant only to let him know she was there. The cub's head lifted a fraction, the wet whiskers clinging together, his gaze holding hers with a kind of unsteady focus. Another gust came through the trees, shaking the canopy until heavy drops fell in clusters, striking the ground with a sound almost louder than the rain. The cub flinched and took a short, uncertain step sideways, his paws sliding slightly before he found firmer ground. The effort seemed to cost him. He stood still again, sides working faster now. Out here, with his fur soaked through and no shelter to cut the wind, his small body would lose heat quickly. If his muscles stiffened or his energy faltered, he wouldn't be able to travel far enough to reach safety. Every moment left in this open stretch increased the risk. Elena shifted her weight, easing one boot forward through the waterlogged grass. He watched, tense but unmoving, his eyes dark beneath the wet fur. She paused, giving him time to decide whether to flee or remain. The choice had to be his. Forcing him would only drive him into deeper trouble. Her attention moved briefly to the ground around him. No fresh prints from an adult fox, only his small tracks circling a narrow patch where the grass had been pressed flat. The pattern suggested he had been here for some time, moving little, perhaps since the rain began. The thinness of his calls and the stillness between them told her he was tiring. She spoke again, barely above the sound of the rain. "It's all right." The cub's ears flicked once more at the tone, though his body stayed taut. He shifted one paw, placing it fractionally toward the thicker cover beside the ditch, then froze. The movement was hesitant, but it had direction, and that meant there was still a chance to guide him without causing flight. The wind brought another burst of rain, striking her hood and streaming down over her hands. She stayed where she was, the mud soaking through, feeling the cold creep in. Time was narrowing. His condition would worsen with each passing minute. If he chose to run now, there was no guarantee he would find a dry place before his strength failed. But if he remained too long, the cold itself could stop him. She took another step forward, slow enough that her boots barely disturbed the water. The cub blinked against the rain, his head lowering slightly, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he gave a single, low cry, more a breath than a call, and let it fade into the sound of the storm. The exchange was enough to tell her he was still aware, still present, and for now, still within reach. The cub moved with halting steps toward the darker edge of the trees, his body low, tail dragging in the wet leaves. Elena followed at a distance, her pace measured so as not to drive him deeper into the storm. The trees here grew older, their trunks broad and roots ridged, the ground rising slightly before falling into a shallow dip. The cub disappeared into that hollow, his small shape vanishing beneath a tangle of exposed oak roots that gripped the soil like weathered hands. She stopped a few meters back, scanning the spot. The roots formed a cramped shelter, no more than a narrow cavity pressed into the bank, its entrance half veiled by trailing grass and wet moss. Water slid from the trunk in steady lines, dripping into the space with a dull, rhythmic patter. The cub turned once, curling himself against the curve of the earth, nose tucked to his side. His ears flattened when another drop struck the crown of his head, but he did not move again. Elena crouched, assessing the scene. The ground here was already saturated, the shallow slope channeling runoff toward the base of the oak. A small rivulet threaded its way down, pooling near the entrance to the hollow. In weather like this, that trickle could grow quickly, seeping inward until the floor of his refuge became a slow flood. If the waterline rose even a few centimeters, it would chill him further and force him to move. In his weakened state, leaving the shelter in worsening conditions could be fatal. Staying, however, carried its own risk. The cold would seep into him more deeply here than in open ground, and with each hour his energy reserves would drop. She eased a step closer, her boots sinking into the softened soil. The cub's head lifted, eyes dull but watchful, and his body shifted slightly as if ready to push himself deeper into the hollow. She paused, speaking in the same low, even tone she had used before. "Easy, little one." His ears flicked, but he did not bolt. The way he stayed, half-tensed yet unwilling to flee, suggested exhaustion had overtaken fear. That exhaustion was as dangerous as the water pooling at his paws. She glanced toward the sky through the breaks in the canopy. The storm showed no sign of passing. The drops that fell from the oak's limbs were heavier now, and the rivulet feeding the hollow was beginning to widen. She could not risk leaving him here unattended. If the flow increased, it would reach him in minutes. In her mind, the stakes were simple and urgent. If he remained, the water could trap him. If he ran, the cold and open exposure could finish what the storm had started. The safest choice was to guide him to higher ground, but guiding required movement he might not be able to manage without help. She shifted to one side, trying to make her presence less direct, letting him see that there was space to move past her. The cub's nose lifted faintly, scenting the air, and his eyes flicked toward the clearer ground beyond. For a moment he rocked forward, his forepaws braced, but then he sank back into his crouch, conserving what little strength he had left. Another droplet slid from the root above and struck his shoulder, followed by another at his flank. He shivered once, a brief, involuntary tremor, and laid his head down. Elena stayed still, weighing her next action against the conditions. The cub was at a tipping point. The shelter bought him moments of relief from the wind, but each drop of water brought the threat closer. If she acted too soon, she could startle him into a panicked dash. Too late, and the cold pooling around his paws would drain him entirely. She drew in a steady breath, her eyes fixed on the small, rain-darkened body under the oak, and waited for the chance to move him before that rising trickle turned into a slow, dangerous flood. Elena kept her distance from the hollow beneath the oak, giving the cub a moment's shelter while she scanned the ground beyond. The rain had softened the earth into a slick, dark surface, and here, just beyond the base of the tree, she saw them, paw prints larger than his, pressed into the mud but already losing their shape under the steady downpour. The edges blurred into the soil where water had begun to pool, each mark fading the further it went. She recognized them as adult fox tracks, the stride light yet purposeful, heading toward the denser woodland. If they were fresh, the mother might still be close. If they were old, she could already be far beyond reach. Either way, the line of prints offered the only lead she had. She glanced once toward the cub, his small frame barely visible in the gloom beneath the roots, before turning to follow the trail. The path led through low brambles that sagged under the weight of rain, their thorns catching briefly on her sleeve as she passed. The prints wove between them, disappearing for short stretches where the ground was covered in wet leaves, then reappearing in the softer patches where water had gathered. The rain made every step harder to read, and more than once she crouched low to trace the faint arc of a paw shape with her eyes. Each time she found another, she measured its depth and clarity. The fresher ones still held some definition, but the further she went, the more they blurred, until they were no more than shadows in the soil. She moved with quiet urgency. If the trail washed away completely, she would have nothing to follow. The stakes were sharp in her mind. Finding the mother meant the cub had a chance at reunion and care only she could give. Without her, his survival would depend entirely on human intervention. The rain thickened, striking her hood in bursts, and the air cooled further, making her breath mist faintly as she moved. The woodland grew darker as the canopy thickened overhead, the light from the open track behind her fading to a muted gray. Then the prince veered toward a slope where the earth was loose and dark. Elena climbed steadily, her boots sliding slightly on the wet incline. At the crest, the land opened into a shallow clearing, but here the trail faltered. The ground had given way in a recent slide, a strip of soil and roots torn free by the storm. At its base lay a tangle of broken branches and heavy clumps of earth, piled where the water had driven them. She scanned the edges, searching for a den entrance, and found it half buried against the slope. The rounded opening was clogged with wet debris. The soil above it collapsed inward. No fresh prints marked the area. The structure had been unstable even before the rain. Now it was impassable. She crouched, steadying herself with one hand against the slope, and looked for any sign of movement within. There was nothing but the dark earth and the faint trickle of water sliding along the debris. If the mother had been inside when it fell, there would have been no escape. If she had been out, the collapse would have driven her away. Either way, the den was lost. Elena felt the weight of the conclusion settle. The cub's family was almost certainly gone. The urgency shifted now from search to survival. There was no other safety for him here. She rose, turning back toward the trail she had followed, the rain still falling hard enough to blur the edges of her vision. Each step back toward the oak felt slower, the muddy ground pulling at her boots. The cub's shelter was just as she had left it, the small body curled tightly within, but the water at the entrance had crept closer. She knew then that whatever hope she had carried into the search would not be fulfilled in the way she had wanted. The choice ahead was clear. She would have to be the one to move him, to lift him from the hollow before the rising water, or the cold claimed the chance entirely. The trail had led Elena to the slope's edge, where the soil was raw and freshly torn. Rainwater streamed down its face in narrow rivulets, cutting through the loosened earth and carrying small stones into the hollow below. At the base, tangled branches, uprooted grass, and heavy clumps of soil lay piled in an uneven mound. Just beyond the debris, the shape of a den entrance was visible, or what had once been an entrance. Its rounded frame was crushed inward, half filled with wet earth, the rest choked by snapped roots and slick mud. She stepped closer, her boots sinking into the softened ground, and crouched to peer into the gap. No sound came from within, only the slow patter of water dripping from the debris above. She studied the slope carefully, noting how the storm had stripped away the upper layer of soil, pulling down sections of root that once held the bank together. The collapse had likely been sudden, triggered by the weight of rain, and anything inside would have been sealed in an instant. There were no fresh paw prints around the site, no sign of digging or disturbance after the fall. If the mother had been caught inside, there would have been no escape. If she had been out, the blocked entrance would have driven her away. Either way, the den could not be reclaimed. The cub's family, whether trapped or scattered, would not be returning to him. She stood for a moment, rain running down her sleeves, letting the reality settle in. The stakes shifted sharply now. Until this point, she had carried a thread of possibility, that the mother might emerge, that she might lead the cub back to shelter and care only she could give. But the collapse erased that path. Without her, the cub would not survive alone. The cold, the rain, and his young age meant his chances in the wild were measured in hours, not days. The decision was no longer whether to intervene, but how soon to act before the conditions worsened. Elena's eyes moved over the debris once more, scanning for any movement, any flicker of fur in the shadows. There was nothing but the slow trickle of water along the slope. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, sharp and clean, yet holding a stillness that felt final. She took one last step closer, her foot sinking into the mud near the base, and leaned just enough to see deeper into the collapsed space. The darkness inside was unbroken. There was no safe return to be found here. Turning back toward the route she had come, she quickened her pace without breaking the steady rhythm of her steps. The rain showed no sign of easing, and the temperature had dropped further, making each breath a faint mist. The cub was still in the hollow under the oak roots, and with every minute the water pooling there would creep closer to where he lay. If he remained much longer, the cold and damp could weaken him to the point where even rescue might come too late. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she saw him as she had left him, small, hunched, and still. The water at the entrance of his shelter had deepened, its surface rippling under the steady fall of rain from above. He lifted his head slightly at her approach, ears twitching once before settling back. She knew now that his only chance lay in being moved, carried to a place where warmth and dryness could undo the damage the storm had done. The moment to act had come, and any hesitation would let the cold finish what the collapsed den had begun. Elena approached the oak with slow, deliberate steps, the weight of the decision clear in her movements. The cub was still in the shallow hollow, his body curled tightly, ears flattened against the steady hiss of rain. The water at the entrance had spread further, its edge lapping at his paws, each ripple breaking against the soaked fur of his legs. She knew there was no more time to let him rest in place. If he stayed, the cold would sink too deep, and the storm would take the choice from both of them. Without speaking, she unclasped her coat, shaking off the heaviest drops, and crouched so the fabric hung low over the entrance. The sudden shadow drew his gaze upward, ears pricking slightly before settling again. She let the coat fall like a low roof, shielding him from the worst of the wind and rain, and remained still, giving him space to decide whether to move toward her or away. The cub's nose lifted a fraction, his nostrils twitching as he took in the new scent and shape before him. His body shifted, tense in the shoulders, yet his paws stayed planted in the mud. A shiver rippled through his frame, faint but steady, betraying the cold's grip on him. The shelter beneath the roots had offered brief protection, but now every drop soaking into the soil beneath him was stealing his warmth. His eyes moved between the coat and the narrow opening beyond, weighing the unfamiliar presence against the wet chill that surrounded him. She remained in place, her arm resting lightly on the bank, breathing evenly so nothing in her posture spoke of urgency. A long moment passed before he pushed himself forward, his steps short and careful as if testing the ground. His head dipped low, his body sloping toward her in a slow, uncertain advance. The edge of the coat brushed the top of his head, and he paused, ears flicking back, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he pressed his side briefly against the edge of her boot, the contact light but unmistakable. His fur was cold against the leather, the texture clinging from rain and mud. It was not full trust, but it was not fear either. It was the fragile choice to stay close when distance was still an option. Elena adjusted her stance just enough to widen the cover of the coat, creating a dry pocket between herself and the roots. The cub stepped into it, his tail low, his paws leaving small half-moons in the mud as he shifted his weight. His breathing was still quick, the rise and fall of his ribs visible through his thin, soaked coat. She lowered one hand to the ground beside him, not touching, letting him see the stillness of it. "You're all right," she said softly, the words barely audible over the rain. His ears moved toward the sound, though his eyes stayed fixed on the sheltered space ahead. She could feel the tremors in his body now, the kind that came not from fear but from the cold working its way deeper. Every minute in the open had been sapping his strength. Every step from here on would demand more of him than he could spare without help. The risk was plain. If she did not lift him soon, his ability to move would falter entirely. Yet forcing the moment could undo the fragile choice he had just made to come closer. She waited, keeping the coat in place, until his breathing eased enough for him to lower his head. His flank brushed her boot again, a light, almost imperceptible weight. That small lean was all the signal she needed. It was not surrender, but it was permission to act. The cold had already taken much from him. Now it was her task to keep it from taking more. The rain carried on around them, but beneath the coat, the space between them held steady, and for the first time since she had heard his call, the cub did not turn away. The shed was small and dim, its air warmer than the storm outside but still cool enough to hold the smell of damp wood and straw. Elena set the cub down on a low workbench, his small body swaddled in the folds of a dry towel. The fabric clung gently to his sides, absorbing the water from his fur, and for the first time since she had found him, he was still enough for her to feel the rhythm of his breathing. It was shallow but steadier than before, no longer broken by the faint shivers that had run through him beneath the oak. His eyes opened a fraction, the dark irises clouded with fatigue, then closed again in slow blinks. She stood close, her hand resting lightly against the towel's edge, watching for any sign that his breathing might falter again. Rain drummed hard against the tin roof, the sound sharp and constant. The wind pressed against the shed walls in long, restless surges, rattling the latch on the half-closed door. Each time the gusts came, the cub's ears twitched beneath the towel, but he did not struggle or try to move. His paws remained drawn close to his body, tucked under the fold of cloth, the pads faintly visible where the towel slipped aside. She adjusted it with careful fingers, tucking the edges beneath his chest to keep in as much warmth as possible. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing. The rain had turned the reserve paths into narrow streams, and the trees swayed under the weight of the wind. She kept her gaze on him, counting the small movements of his sides as they rose and fell. Each breath taken here was a gain on the cold he had endured in the open. But the risk was not gone. His strength was still low, his energy reserves almost spent, and a long night lay ahead. If he lost too much body heat before morning, even here, he might not recover it. She reached for a second towel hanging from a peg and laid it gently over the first, layering the warmth without adding weight. Beneath it, the cub shifted once, a faint stretch of his forelegs before they tucked back under again. The minutes drew on, marked only by the storm's noise and the quiet rhythm of his breathing. At intervals, Elena dipped her fingers into a small bowl of water warmed near the heater in the corner, touching them lightly to his lips in case thirst stirred him. Once, his tongue flicked out, a brief, instinctive motion, and he swallowed. The response was small but important, a sign that he still held enough strength to respond. She repeated it after a while, patient in her pace, letting him rest between each attempt. The shed's single lamp cast a low, amber light over the workbench, softening the hard edges of the tools hung on the wall and the dark shapes of folded nets. In its glow, the cub's damp fur began to lift slightly where it had been flattened by rain, the towel drawing away the last of the water. His breathing deepened fractionally, no longer so quick, and once, when the wind slammed hard against the door, he opened his eyes and held her gaze for a heartbeat before closing them again. She knew it was not trust yet, but it was a kind of acceptance. The simple choice to remain still in her presence. As the night settled deeper, she adjusted the towel once more, making sure the folds stayed close to him. The rain's voice outside seemed endless, but inside the sound softened, as if the shed itself was holding back the worst of it. She stood for a long moment, her hand still resting near his shoulder until his breathing evened out again. Beyond the walls, the storm raged on, but here, for now, he was warm, dry, and alive. The morning was pale and still, the kind of spring light that softened the edges of the landscape and carried the faint scent of damp earth from the storms that had passed days earlier. In her arms, the cub felt lighter than she remembered, his body no longer trembling with the deep, uncontrollable shivers that had marked those first hours in the shed. His fur was dry now, brushed into soft layers that lifted faintly in the breeze, the rough patches from rain and mud replaced with a quiet gloss. She walked slowly toward the clearing, each step measured, the sound of her boots muted by the grass still holding traces of morning dew. The cub's head lifted slightly, his nose testing the air, his body tensing in a way that was not fear but awareness, the instinctive recognition of space opening around him. The clearing was small but bordered by dense undergrowth, offering cover within only a few strides. Beyond that, the grass rolled gently toward the tree line, long and unbroken. It was a safe place, no sign of recent disturbance, no human scent except her own. She crouched, lowering him carefully until his paws touched the ground. For a moment, he stayed pressed close to her hands, the warmth of her skin still lingering against his fur. His ears moved once, then again, catching sounds in the distance, the soft rustle of grass and the faint call of a bird somewhere beyond the trees. He took one step forward, hesitated, and glanced back, not to seek comfort, but to check the space he had just left. Elena stayed still, letting him set his own pace. The first few steps were tentative, his paws sinking lightly into the grass, the blades folding and springing back beneath his weight. Then his gait lengthened, each stride more certain than the last. He stopped once midway, standing in a shaft of sunlight that caught the faintest movement of the tall stems around him. The air lifted his fur in gentle swirls, and he raised his head fully now, nostrils flaring, eyes half closed in the touch of the breeze. There was no visible change in his stance beyond that pause, yet in the stillness it was clear. He knew where he was meant to go. She did not call to him or move forward. The choice was his, and he made it without looking back again. With a small shift of weight, he trotted into the grass, the tips brushing along his sides as the green closed around him. Within seconds, his shape broke into fragments between the stems. A flash of flank, the flick of an ear, until only movement in the grass marked his passage. The sound of his steps faded quickly, replaced by the steady hum of the field in spring. Elena remained in the clearing, her hands resting loosely at her sides, eyes following the last ripple of grass where he had passed. The breeze moved through the open space, bending the stems in slow waves that rolled towards the trees. Somewhere in that shifting green, the cub had vanished back into a world that would test him, but also belonged to him in a way no human shelter ever could. She let her gaze rest there a moment longer, then turned toward the narrow track home, the sound of the grass still whispering faintly behind her.